Hello and welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. We are so excited to have you here, whether you're a new listener or a returning one. Before we jump into today's episode, two quick things. Number one, shout out to Sarah.
Oh, yay, Sarah!
I was like, I didn't know if I was going to be wooing alone. For winning our giveaway of the tote bag and coffee mug. She also happens to be Aaron and I's first cousin. But we did agree after the Alexandra episode, we pledged no marriages or wars between us. We also have no cousin Willie, which is a bit of a bummer, but we said we could move past that. And number two, as we said in the outro last week, if you heard, so that would have been during Alexandra part 3 at the end, we said we are going to start playing short listener, quote unquote, final judgments about any of our previous historical figures. So please stick around at the end to hear this week's listener, Matt, aka Aaron's husband and history teacher's view on Tsarina Alexandra.
Yeah,
you don't have to be a history teacher to send in your judgment. So if you either agree with us or disagree, you can send just an MP3 or MP4 file, anywhere from like a minute, I would say, to maximum 5 minutes, to ambivalent.offenders.podcast@gmail.com. And then hopefully we'll again play yours either during an outro, an intro, or maybe even a mini episode during the middle of the week if we have quite a few. So we'll try that. It's always fun to hear what other people think after listening to evidence.
Yeah, obviously we all come about it in different ways. We all have different life experiences. So it would be interesting to see how other people approach these figures.
Aaron, have you even heard what his judgment is?
No, I have not. So it'll be a surprise to me too.
Nice. So we'll get a live reaction from both of us.
I know. Yeah, I have no idea what he's going to say.
So we are out of Russian history.
Yay.
I can say that. I can't say forever, but if you're somebody who was like, okay, let's get moving out of Russia. We are out of Russia. I honestly have no idea what we're doing, except for that it's medieval history because, of course, it's Aaron. As I said, don't even know the person's name today. Aaron, does it happen to be a Henry or a James?
No, it's a woman, actually.
Oh, shock. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it is a woman. Yeah, as Jamie said, I know for a subset of you guys, you hear medieval and you're groaning, but I assure you, this one's going to be an adventure. We are talking about Isabella of France today. Yeah. We have everything. I put a reel on this on Instagram, so plug to our Instagram. We have everything: himbo boyfriends, catty nicknames, preteen brides, Tower of London escapes, and multiple beheadings. So it's gonna be a fun one.
I saw the relationship or possibly relationship triangle, but I didn't know Isabella would be the one who would be focusing on. So I guess we're continuing our female series. Although,
yes,
definitively, I will say my next one is not a female. So if you're like, get away from those female villains.
No, but
there's
her
plenty
husband, to be fair, Edward II, her husband's going to play a large part of this. Can't really tell her story without talking about her husband. She's also typically known as the she-wolf of France.
Okay.
I know, badass. That wasn't meant as a compliment, by the way. It was meant to convey her ruthlessness. So you don't know anything about her or King Edward II of England?
Nope.
Okay, so you're coming at it fresh.
Probably for a lot of listeners. I haven't looked. Aaron didn't even send me a script. Honestly, she gave me hints about one thing that will happen during this episode. But besides that, I'm going in blind, which is always fun.
Yeah. Which I'm excited because I wish I could experience the story for the first time all over again. So it's kind of like that, having you. And I also consider this sort of a prequel to my John of Gaunt series, as Isabella is John's paternal grandmother.
Oh.
She got a quick mention in that episode, but you don't have to have listened to that episode. That you don't need any backstory. Yeah. Okay. So right off the top, I do want to say that there's a few things that make this one difficult. Obviously, it's going to be very long ago, so we don't have diaries. We don't get a lot of accounts of what Isabella was thinking. So there's a lot of inference based on just her actions.
What years are we talking?
We're in the 14th century, so the 1300s.
Okay.
So we do get a few letters from her, but that's kind of about the extent of it, explaining some of her actions. Second, in terms of research, a lot of the myths about her fall apart. There's a traditional story that's often told that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So I'm going to try to obviously do the more balanced real story versus that fictionalized, more sensationalized version.
Okay.
The book that I use for this research, and a lot of this research comes from, is called Isabella of France, The Rebel Queen by Catherine Warner. She's done a lot of work on Isabella of France and her husband, King Edward II of England. So
Okay.
massive plug to that book. I think that she does a really good job of telling you what's been sensationalized, what's come into the story after the fact, and what we actually have evidence for.
England is unified as a country at this point. Right?
Yeah, so it's post-Norman conquest, 1066. We'll get in a little bit into the backstory, but the kings of England still have a good property portfolio in France. So they do still own some parts of France, which we'll talk about later, which is important.
Yeah.
But,
I remember it. Do they still do it in coronations now? I mean, I know for the longest time they would even say like, and King of France, like King of France.
Yeah, I don't know if they still do it, but yeah, at this time it would certainly be, they don't hold quite as much land in France as they used to at this time in the 1300s, but they certainly do still hold. And we'll come back to that when it's appropriate, because that does play a key role in one of the parts of the story. So,
Okay. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
You can say again if you're going to answer it. At this time, how's the throne handed down? Are women allowed to take the throne by themselves, or does it have to be? Okay.
No, we won't have a queen regnant of England until Mary the First in, the 1500s.
Well, yeah.
So she's the first one. This story is about a queen consort, but you'll see she does a little bit more than queen consorting.
You did say there was some kind of connection with Alexandra with that. A little more of the stronger figure, even though the...
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of similarities, although the relationship between Isabella and her husband, Edward II, doesn't hold as much as Nicholas and Alexandra. Okay. We'll say that.
No, not as many loving love letters and nicknames.
No, it has as much stress on it, but they don't withstand that stress. I'll say that.
Okay, I'll let you.
So, diving right in, like many women of the era, Isabella doesn't really become part of the record until she marries, because chroniclers are disinterested in women unless they do something that we would consider fun and or spicy, or when they come into an orbit of a man.
Okay.
So, womp womp. There's a silver lining, though, for Isabella, because she does marry very young. Okay. So she appears to us as a preteen, and I'm not saying preteen marriage is cool. I'm not condoning that.
Well, we know a little bit more because she's married young. We're not waiting to hear her story until she's like 30.
Exactly. So in terms of early life, we don't really know too much about her. I think at this point, the one thing that you would need to know is that Isabella is the daughter of the King of France.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask is, in order to marry the King of England, you're going to have to be from a high status family. Like where?
Yeah, she's part of the Capetian dynasty, which has been on the French throne since 1987 or 1987.
Like,
not 1987, 987. Sorry.
Okay.
Wrong.
Take that one out.
Yeah, her mother died when she was 9 years old, and then January 23rd. 1308, Isabella marries at the age of 12, which was the legal minimum age to be married.
Okay. Not loving that, but
it doesn't make it better if you know that they usually don't consummate the marriage at this time.
Yeah, that helps. How old's Edward?
The groom, Edward II, was 23.
Oh, yeah, I really don't like that.
Well, it's not the worst age gap.
No, I know. But the 12 and 23.
Yeah. But they do not start sleeping together for a few.
Okay. I'm glad about that.
So we're going to meet Isabella's hubby and give some context into his life and his England. You know, I hate talking about men during a woman's story, but you do need to know about her husband because we need to know who she's marrying and the England that she's marrying into.
Sure.
Because Isabella's husband, he's not like the typical bland medieval princeling. He's complicated. So, first of all, Edward II, he comes very late in the marriage of his parents, King Edward I and his Queen Eleanor. So his father's the king in Braveheart. Have you watched Braveheart?
Like a long time ago.
I haven't, but Edward he's a famous warmonger. You usually hear him called, he's the Hammer of the Scots, or his other nickname is Longshanks. He was tall.
That's what I was thinking about. Okay, that's where my brain was.
Got Longshanks.
Really weird.
Both father and son are in Braveheart, which I've never seen. I know also Isabella's in it too. She's the love interest of William Wallace in it.
Oh.
But myth busting, she wasn't even 10 at that time. Yeah, so she was not banging hot Scottish men. Sorry to break it to you guys.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Just to bring this back around, you're not going to hear a lot about battle because there's a lot of battles against the Scots during this time, and then as we'll go into Isabella's life. So you're not going to hear about that. I'm sorry if you put this on to listen to me talk about William Wallace. No, it's an Isabella podcast, and unless it impacts her, I'm going to stay on task. So kind of like what we did with the Russian Revolution.
The best they could. I feel like you had to do some side stories, but yeah.
You're going to get some fun side stories here.
Yeah.
Especially since there's a lot of things that you have to talk about in order to put it in context.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with what's going on in 1300 England. So
we'll talk about Edward II's parents again. We've got Longshanks and Eleanor. Yeah. They had already lost 2 sons and they'd lose a third. So this was their 4th try. Edward II. So he's like the last great hope in terms of an heir. And he never seems to have gotten along with his father. It's giving like athletic, toxic masculinity, daddy, and like sensitive son.
Oh, okay. And the dynamic.
Yeah.
Just let me do my art, Dad.
Basically. I just see it as him being very emo and being like, you don't understand me, Dad.
Dad's like, gotta join a sports team, bud.
You've got to at least minimum battle the Scots 1 time.
Okay, so there's some angst already.
Yeah, but his parents were a really happy couple, and this is a side story, but I just got to tell it because I love it, because it's one of those few times where you get like an insight into somebody's relationship in the past. His parents were rarely apart, and that's why actually Edward II, Isabella's husband, is actually born in Wales, and he will become the first English Prince of Wales.
Oh,
not the first Prince of Wales, but the first English one.
Okay,
is born in, because again, Daddy's always warring, and he wars with the Welsh and Scotland. I'm going to tell you a little tale about his parents. Every year, like the day after Lent, Edward quote unquote let Eleanor's ladies trap him in his bed, and he'd pay him a ransom so he could go into her bedroom and presumably bang. At this time, because according to custom, you weren't supposed to sleep with your spouse during Lent. So literally the first opportunity he got, he'd pay a ransom, and then he'd go and they'd sleep together.
It's very not what I would think about. It's a little sexy tradition.
Yeah, but in 1291, which is a year after Eleanor's death, he kept up the tradition and gave the ladies the ransom money that he would normally have given them if she had been alive. Cut to me sobbing. He does remarry, but
of course. Go after what it was in John of God.
Yeah, it was Philip and Edward. Yeah, they are. This is very similar to, except for not
where he didn't have a mistress until right at the end. Now I've lost all hope.
Edward waits until his wife dies, then he remarries. But to be fair, he only had 1 son, and kids died early those days. But also just to devastate you more, Edward I, who, again, we don't think of as sentimental. He's a famous warmonger. He wrote after Eleanor's death, Whom living we dearly cherished, and whom dead we cannot cease to love.
Oh, that's pretty sweet.
Tell me that's cute. But anyway, we'll go back to Edward II.
Get me dead.
Yeah, he's misunderstood. You don't understand me. But again, his father did remarry. Okay, he's 60. Guess how old his new wife is?
25.
Younger.
23.
Younger.
20.
20, yeah.
Oh, God.
So Edward was only 5 years younger than his stepmom. But his stepmom tried to make the relationship between dad and son better. So she was really good at that. And she seemed to honor Edward's relationship with Eleanor. They even named their first daughter Eleanor after his dead wife.
I don't know how I feel about that, but I'll just move past it.
Well, in 1300, a young nobleman named Piers Gaveston enters the prince's service. He would have been slightly older than Edward. This would spark what seems very much like a love affair. We don't know exactly what went on, but it seems obvious that Edward loved Piers more than anyone else in his life.
Like love, like,
yeah.
Is it like very, historians being like, they were best friends?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say next. There's a big debate about it, obviously. Like, were they besties? Were they lovers? Outside of a time machine, we're never going to know. Both men do go on to obviously have kids with their wives. We have to remember that medieval people didn't think of sexuality like we do now. It's not their identity. It's what you do. It's not who you are. So you can read a lot. There's a latest theory they were blood brothers. And I'm like, no, you'll see the way that he acts. I'm pretty sure that he loved him in every sense of the word.
Okay.
But in any case, in 1307, King Edward I, Edward's mean daddy, he's not happy with the closeness between Piers and his son. He banishes Gaveston from England.
Okay. Is this before he's married Isabella?
Yeah, this is before. This is prologue, but it does carry into her marriage,
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, but then mean daddy, Edward I, dies. And the first thing that Edward does, what do you think as soon as he becomes king? What's his literal first thing?
He brings his best, quote unquote, best friend back.
Yeah. And he gave him an earldom that was immediate. I mean, maybe not the first thing you should focus on when you're newly king, but
yeah,
there's a common misconception that Edward II was like wimpy, scrawny, comparing him to his dad, who was long.
We'll be back after a short break.
Hey everyone, if you're interested in the world of high strangeness, Bigfoot, UFO, paranormal, or conspiracy theories, we have the podcast for you. The Nerd Informer podcast digs deep into all your favorite conspiracies and other high strangeness. We have special guests who will answer all the questions you might have and give you insight you didn't even know you wanted. Check out the Nerd Informer podcast today, available everywhere you get your podcast, and always remember, question everything.
I know in Braveheart, he's seen as effeminate and things like that. But I think that in large part, people are doing that because he had male favorites.
Yeah.
We're not going to engage in that. In fact, he was really tall, really handsome, and really strong. Those are all things that people noted about him. So we shouldn't think that like Isabella was disappointed with her husband. He would have been a hot king.
Yeah, we're more putting like not today's view of it, but the 80s, 70s. Yeah, it's like, oh, if has these close relationships with men, then he must be effeminate.
Exactly.
Yeah, as opposed to today, where it would be less homophobic.
Exactly. I wanted to put that out because a lot of depictions paint him like that, and that's just not what we see. What set him apart was his hobbies and stuff were very different than the like traditional. And I'm not just talking about boning Piers. His hobbies included digging ditches.
That's a hobby?
Yeah, apparently that's a hobby. swimming, which was very unusual at the time, and hanging with the lower classes. He had a lot of lower class friends. He'd be friends with fishermen, carpenters. It's very unusual. As you can imagine, the nobility were very chill about that.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to say opposite of Alexander, but like Alexander not connecting with anybody, including the nobility, and them all liking her. And he's got, I got buds all over the place. And they're like
he would go and hang with fishermen and go on trips and stuff. And the nobility were like, these people? Are you sure?
They go off and dig a ditch.
Yeah, I'm still not sure how digging ditches is a hobby, but that was something.
Maybe I'll try it. I need some more hobbies.
It really confused and confounded the nobility and the chroniclers at the time. They were like, what is he doing? And then swimming too. Swimming was not a thing that people did.
Yeah, more drowning.
Yeah. So back to Isabella and the wedding. So imagine you're 12.
Yep.
Got it. If you're in Spice Girls and Animorphs.
Maybe, yeah. I was still maybe at that age, 12. I had micro bangs. I had cut my bangs at that time.
I'm pretty sure 12.
Like 12 is what? 6th grade?
Yeah.
5th and 6th grade. 5th grade is when we got contacts. Before that, we had the giant glasses.
And I'm pretty sure we were still into Spice Girls, at least nominally.
Definitely. And also Michael Crichton. Like,
a lot of Michael Crichton.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to assume Isabella was as well.
Okay.
So you're at your wedding. Kind of weird.
Yeah.
And your husband's BFF, Piers, is wearing your wedding jewelry.
Oh. Okay. Like your ring?
Not your ring, but your gifts that you're given.
Okay.
But this is actually, I hate to say it, but it is actually a myth. People always tell it in stories, but unfortunately there's a lack of sources for this. I want it to be true, but it's not. But this is what you normally hear.
Okay.
But don't think that this makes the dynamic
any better.
Still very much like that. The wedding jewel story might be more fiction than fact, but after the marriage, the newlyweds, they land back in England because they got married in France.
Okay.
And they land in Dover, and Edward runs right up to Pierce and hugs and kisses him in front of everybody. He had eyes for nobody else. Isabella, she came onto the land later, so she wouldn't have seen it, but I think she would have realized soon after that there was going to be some trouble ahead in her marriage.
Maybe, but 12-year-olds are, well, let's just say they're socially inept. She'd be like, oh, wow, that's so sweet. Like,
that's cute.
Yeah.
Love each other.
Right. I wonder how much of her being like, oh, this is the problem at 12.
The wedding story, not true, but let's go into the coronation. Piers is obviously going to play a huge role in the ceremony.
Does he wear her crown?
No, but his behavior at the banquet afterwards would cause, let's just say, a stir. First of all, at the banquets, they have all the heraldry up. So like the coat of arms, which is very important back then.
Right.
What shows your family. So Edward has his.
Yeah.
But Isabella, her coat of arms is not there. But do you know whose coat of arms is there next to Edward?
Guessing Piers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't love that. If I was Isabella, I'd be like, okay. It's a mistake. They must have forgotten to put it up.
Yeah. As a 12-year-old, you could probably rationalize that. And then instead of talking to her all night, he chats up Piers all night long.
To be fair, she's 12 and he's 23. How much do they have in common?
That's what the book I read says. Like, okay, they just met too. You know, they don't really know each other, but it's still kind of.
Yeah. Might as well spend some time with your 12-year-old bride.
At minimum, ask her who her favorite Spice Girl is. Come on.
Get a little information.
But it's enough where her uncles and her brother, who are there, they're so pissed.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it's even said that one of the English barons almost fought Piers Gaveston at this.
Wow.
Like he had to be physically restrained from fighting Piers at this. So I'm living for the drama.
Yeah.
Like, I would have hated to be Isabella, but I am living for it.
I mean, I would have hated being 12 years old. Back at 12. And now you're making me marry
somebody
who's in
you
love
don't
with.
know.
Yeah, who's in love with somebody else.
Yeah. It's complicated. But as I had said before, Isabella and Edward aren't sleeping together right away. They don't have a kid for a couple years.
Okay.
So at least that.
When
and we
did
don't.
she- Okay,
Oh.
I'll wait. I'll wait
Yeah,
chronologically.
Don't worry. And we don't really know how she felt about Piers Gaveston. From the evidence, it seems like she at least put up with him. Again, she was young. I don't think she was in any position to
Right. I can't.
like push back or anything on that.
Picturing 12-year-old me. I really don't like how
I'd just be like, I just got to crimp my hair better and he'll pay attention to me.
I remember in middle school.
He probably would have cut the micro bangs to get his attention.
Well, maybe, but I'm just thinking of my like nervousness of like with people. I can't imagine me speaking up to my 23-year-old hot husband.
I would really like it if you didn't hang out with Piers.
No.
I mean, I know if you really need to, it's fine. But I would appreciate not.
Yeah, can we spend some time together?
Mm-hmm.
Like 10 minutes?
She at least put up with the Piers and Edward situation. Not that she really would have any choice.
And I
once
like she's going to be turning into the she-wolf. And she's going to get some teeth here.
Well, when she was about 15 is when they really became a full couple and were doing full couple things and
Getting it on.
getting it on. And because of how, spoiler, horribly, their marriage ends, and because of Edward's love for his male favorites like Piers, a lot of people assume that their marriage was bad all the way through. But it actually does seem to have at least developed into affectionate. We can't all be Edward and Philippa from our John of Gaunt episode, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Waiting for that mistress. So
Yeah.
your wife's on death's door.
Mhm. There is actually a recording of Edward missing a meeting with Isabella's dad. So they were in France and he overslept because he had overexerted himself, we should say, with Isabella. And there's another famous story of
Daddy probably wouldn't like that.
No, there's another famous story in 1313 when Edward rescues Isabella from a burning tent.
Whoa.
He was naked. They were together. He was naked. I'm like, HBO, where's this miniseries?
I know. I would watch that. Yeah, that previous of Daddy waiting while he's just oversleeping after.
It was like particularly long session.
And then a naked tent burning rescue.
He was very brave about it, and they said that he saved her and many more, and that he rescued her above all others because he loved her with, they call it amour fine or fine love or courtly love. He loved her a lot. So even though Piers is there, it's not that Isabella and Edward aren't getting along at this point. The Piers problem was still a problem. Basically, all the nobles hated him. He was said to be really haughty, and he thought himself much better than them thanks to his relationship with Edward. Isabella was probably, again, she was really young and learning the ropes in these early years. I think that's why there's a chance that she thought him mostly harmless, a nuisance, a future Isabella problem. Piers, for his part, did little to endear himself to the people he should have been sucking up to, aka the nobles. He did a bunch of nicknames for the nobles. So I'm going to get your judgments on these nicknames. So tell me.
Are these public nicknames to them?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of them was called Burst Belly.
Yeah, I wouldn't love that.
The Fiddler. I don't know. There's some meaning behind it, but
okay. I mean, that's not the worst. I prefer that one over.
Then the other one was the Black Dog of Arden.
Oh, I kind of like that one.
Yeah, that one sounds pretty badass. But
better than Burst Belly.
Yeah. Regardless, none of the nobles liked them, even.
They're like, stop giving me nicknames.
I know.
We're not friends.
Yeah, Piers, I'll say later, I think he's very much a himbo. And I don't know if he understood that he was making such enemies or just thought because he was whatever with the king that he could do whatever.
I just see him going into a crowd and using all these nicknames, and everybody's like rolling their eyes and like,
Yeah, he's and again, going back to our Instagram thing, he's the one who I have on that story. So this is what's going on. What's ever going on with Piers and Edward? Isabella's growing up. She's becoming that true partner to Edward. They're spending more and more time together regardless of Piers. And she actually had plenty of time with Edward herself, as there's this constant cycle of the nobles keep exiling Piers, then Edward sends him back, and then they exile him again.
oh, okay.
Like, keeps happening. It's
Rotation.
like rinse and repeat. Yeah.
Okay.
Edward just cannot survive without Piers. As soon as they exile him, he's already plotting to get him back. One of the contemporary chronicles said that Edward loved an evil male sorcerer more than he did his wife, the most elegant lady and a very beautiful woman. I'm like, it's not Isabella who wrote this, but this is what I would write if I was her.
Evil sorcerer.
There's so much you could go into the exiles, but then this episode would be even longer than it's already going to be.
But yeah, exile, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I just think he just keeps doing it. Regardless, the Piers problem would solve itself sooner rather than later if Isabella was hoping. Piers comes back from one of his exiles in 1312. And the barons are, shall we say, not pleased. They even cut off money for the king because the king goes to him, and they cut money off just to tell him how serious they are.
Right.
And again, I don't blame them. This is his third exile that he's returned from in less than 5 years. And that doesn't even include the one, I don't think that includes the one that Edward I sent him on.
Okay.
So
they're like, no, we're serious. Stop bringing him back.
Exactly. They were not playing around this time. They do eventually capture him. And this time they pounced on their chance to eliminate him once and for all. He was beheaded without trial. On a hill near Warwick. So his body they just left his body there to be taken by Dominican friars later. That's the end of Piers. I think if they knew what was to come next, they probably would have left Piers alone.
Okay.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, Edward's going to be a little pissed.
Yeah, and Piers, R.I.P. Edward doesn't ever forget him either. He continues to have prayers said for Piers and other reminders the rest of his life, Edward's life. He'd also, in the next 10 years, punish almost all the barons involved in Piers's death, including his own cousin, who was also Isabella's uncle. Again, they're all related.
Right. We wouldn't punish you.
No. This guy's the Earl of Lancaster. Eventually, all of them would befall bad fates. Revenge would be Edward's eventually. And this is where you're like, okay, what would Isabella have thought about Piers dying? Spoiler, we don't know. Very limited evidence, but she did attend the funeral, and she was with Edward when he found out.
Okay.
I'm sure.
Is she in her early 20s at this point?
No, I think she's still about 16 years old.
Oh, okay. So
she's still really young. I'm sure for part of her must have been, again, this is not based on evidence, but for me, I feel like part of her must have been relieved and been like, okay, well, maybe now Edward will pay attention to me. They've cultivated that relationship. They've become closer over the years. This is actually where she gave birth to her first child, a son, an heir. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Always good for, always good for a queen. He's the future Edward III. She gives birth to him on November 13th, 1312. So Edward III, he's the one who you hate, who cheated on his wife, Philippa, on her deathbed.
See, it runs in the family.
It's really good for Isabella, obviously, as a queen when you get the heir, and it's good for Edward to have an heir. One chronicle, which is really catty, states that our King Edward has now reigned 6 full years and has until now achieved nothing praiseworthy or memorable, except that by a royal marriage he has raised up for himself a handsome son and heir to the throne. So, meow. But also true.
Could be worse.
Yeah. Piers is dead. He's got a son. What do you think Edward does next? What's your take on him?
I think he needs a new best friend.
He actually found 3 of them.
Fuck all the
I won't go into their stories because the worst is yet to come. But Isabella and Edward, they still got a good relationship. They had kids in these years. So between that and records of their travel, we know that they spent a lot of time together, which they didn't need to. So you're thinking they obviously liked each other enough to want to spend time together.
Right.
They wouldn't have had to if they didn't like each other. They could have just one been at one castle, the other.
Found ways, to avoid each other.
So I think these would have been probably Isabella's most stable and happy years in the marriage, despite the 3 other dudes who were hanging around.
She's not part of the squad, but she doesn't feel totally abandoned.
No, and I don't think none of them achieve Piers level obsession. She was just doing the things that we usually think that medieval queens do their days. But now we're going to enter a new favorite. His name is Hugh Despenser.
Okay.
So if Piers, R.I.P., if he was a bit of a himbo, Hugh's a monster.
Oh.
I'm thinking Piers is like that dim, hot athlete in teen shows.
Yeah.
I'm thinking Tim Riggins.
Oh, nice.
So I'm thinking Piers.
Okay.
Hugh, he's like the bad boy who leads whoever they date down like a very dark path.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And with Hugh, he actually comes along with a father who actually has the same name. So there's 2 Hugh Despensers, which is bad for Isabella in the country. And it's also even worse for my storytelling. So I'm going to call them Hugh Sr. and Hugh Jr.
And not big and little.
Here on out.
Big and little.
No. So we've got Hugh Sr., Hugh Jr. Hugh Jr. is the one who becomes the new Piers, but Daddy's along for the ride.
Oh, okay.
So think of it that way. So 13, 18, Hugh Jr., he's about 30 years old at the time. He becomes Edward's chamberlain. In essence, he controls access to the king. You can't go into the king's presence or you can't write to him without Hugh Jr. knowing. A very powerful role, which is dangerous for a man like him because he immediately abuses it and makes people basically pay for access. So
he did say monster, so I'm going to add up some of his monsters.
This is minimum. It gets worse from here out. So
I'm assuming.
Within 2 years, Hugh Jr. had replaced all those other dudes, those other 3.
No more squad.
No more squad. There's a quote from one of the chronicles at the time that said, that no man might speak with the king himself would not be governed by no manner of man, but only his father. So senior and him. So new Piers Gaveston.
Is Daddy Hugh Sr., is he a puppet master or is he just, I'm going to take advantage of this as well?
I think he's more of taking advantage. You hear more about Junior in the record. They both take advantage, but I don't really consider him, at least from what I've seen, that he's a puppet master.
Okay. Is Senior going to play a big part in the story?
Not as much as Junior. Junior's the big one, but Senior does pop up occasionally. Hugh Jr. is the new Piers. He's, and this is again where we don't know what their relationship was like. Was there a sexual component? Was it just, BFFs? We don't know. Actually, Hugh Jr. was married to Edward's niece. And we'll mention that relationship later because it's weird. Whatever it was, Edward displays that same obsession.
Yeah.
He has zero chill when it comes to his men. He loses his damn mind as soon as he has a hot piece in front of him.
Okay, I kind of relate there, but I'm a little less.
You can't do that as king.
Right. Yeah, I don't have any powers. I can lose my chill over.
Yeah. And you at least got to choose ones who aren't monsters. Well, Piers, again, R.I.P., he was annoying and arrogant, but relatively harmless himbo.
Yeah, it didn't seem like he used his position to, obviously he had some rewards to his position, but it didn't seem like
he's not gathering as much money and stuff.
Right.
But this is where Hugh Jr. immediately uses his influence to get him and Daddy his lands and money. I'm thinking the peasants of the Peasants' Revolt, which we talked about in the John of Gaunt episode, have been dying to behead this man.
Give us this man.
And of course, this makes them many enemies, including our girl, Queen Isabella. I think early on, she must have realized that this is like a whole other beast. They would just run over Edward and again use whatever means necessary to gain as much land and power as they could. Really like thuggish ways to get power is what it seems like. And again, Junior was also married to Edward's niece, Eleanor de Clare, as I mentioned before. There's rumors of the niece and uncle that they were like Damon and Rhaenyra, which is a House of Dragon reference. I don't know if you watch House of Dragon.
I don't. But I'm guessing it's some ancestral thing.
Yeah, there's some weird throuple situation with Edward Jr. and Eleanor, perhaps. We know that they're like the closest. Yeah, it's weird. His niece is always around, as is Junior, who was married to his niece. But whatever it was, like this time, as Isabella's very much on the outside of everything.
Yeah, I would want to be.
But this is, you'll see, this is going to be hard because I don't want to say she's in love with her husband, but, you know, at least they've had a really good relationship up to this point. And so the barons who hated Piers realized, as much as Isabella, that Hugh Sr. and Hugh Jr. were going to be a big problem. So there's once again this back and forth between the dispensers and the barons that I don't really want to get into because Isabella's not involved in that.
Sure.
But we do know that it got so bad that Isabella begs her husband to send the dispensers away in exile. He had just given birth to their fourth kid. She's about 25 at this point.
Yeah.
She's on her knees begging him to send these dispensers away. And whether it was her words or not, Edward does begrudgingly send the dispensers into exile.
Oh, wow.
So she does win this battle, but in the process had created enemies of the dispensers, who I will remind you are psychopaths.
Right.
So not the people you want to make enemies of. Well, how long do you think this exile lasted? Knowing Edward and
like
his chill.
Like 2 months.
A little bit more.
3 months? 6 months.
Or a little over 5. So that's actually pretty good for Edward, if we're going to be honest.
Like immediately exiled. No, come back.
Yeah, I mean, that is basically as soon as his favorites are exiled. And that's what's so weird is he's so disinterested in kingship and actually ruling, except for when it comes to his favorites. And then he immediately gets into action. And he was ready to go to war for the dispensers. It's only just over 5 months that they're in exile. And then they come back into England.
So why aren't the barons, are the barons angry at Edward? It seems like they're taking all the anger out on his favorites, but is he getting any flack?
That's a good question. I think a lot of times they point to the favorites because it's easier than telling the king, because it's more dangerous to tell the king that you think he's doing bad. We'll say at this point, no king has been deposed. No king has been overthrown. Yet.
Okay.
So this is all new. So they would not have thought, oh, we're just going to replace Edward. They're like, we're stuck with this dude, but maybe
we can get rid of these side people.
Dispenser's gone. Then they come back a couple months later. This period's really bad for the country. It's basically like a war, which we won't go into super detail because, again, it's outside of this podcast. Under the influence of the dispensers, the king became, in a lot of ways, as greedy and bloodthirsty as his favorites. There's a quote that the king's harshness has indeed increased so much today that no one, however great or wise, dares to cross the king's will. You do see the slow
transformation.
Where he's becoming more bloodthirsty.
He's that partner who slowly turns into his, takes on the traits of his other partner.
Yeah, so within weeks of the dispensers coming back, at least 20 noblemen had been executed, including Edward's cousin, Isabella's uncle, that Earl of Lancaster, who had been one of the men who executed Piers Gaveston.
Okay.
So at long last, Edward has gotten revenge on almost, if not all, the men who executed Piers and sent the Despensers into that temporary exile.
Mhm.
From what you can see, the Despensers and Isabella, they're on a collision course.
Right.
You know? It's about this time that we get like the first clear sign that the royal marriage was in trouble. There's very much a lack of contact in 1322, 1323 between Isabella and Edward. She almost drops out of the records around this time. They have no more children, which obviously could be for many
Different
reasons.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder that the relationship has been pulled apart by the Despensers.
Yeah.
That
probably
Isabella
not
wasn't spending time with him.
Right. It's probably Oxen's razor.
Yes.
Like she's suddenly not having kids at the same
Mhm.
time when this monster daddy and son are taking control.
Yeah, and remember that Hugh Jr., he's the Chamberlain, so he's controlling access. She wouldn't be able to just, even as queen, she wouldn't be able to access him without. And a chronicle even bitchily called Despenser the king's husband.
Ooh.
And later, Isabella would write to the Archbishop of Canterbury that Hugh Jr. wished to dishonor us as much as he could. So, in the fall of 1322, Edward's back warring with the Scots. It would be his last campaign, which he obviously didn't know.
Mhm.
It's tragic, you know, that you never know when
It's
it'll
your
be the last time.
Last one. Yeah. You would have savored it a little more.
I know. What he didn't intend was that the Scots would lead an invasion into England in retaliation. Edward didn't win any fans with this as he fled, and he left a bunch of gold and treasure to be taken by the Scotch. Very humiliating. But the worst was that Isabella was under real danger. She actually had been staying at a priory about 80, 90 miles away from the army, so pretty safe.
Yeah.
But eventually the Scots did get to her, and it was up to like her squires. She didn't have an army or anything to defend her. It's just her like household squires to defend the priory until she was able to get onto a ship and escape. Even if she escaped, it wasn't without loss. So one of her ladies in waiting died during this. We don't know how. At least the chronicle doesn't tell us how. And then another one possibly dying after. I don't know, a little bit of a trigger warning, but she goes into early labor and dies after one of the other ones. So Isabella, we know, would never forget this event. And she'd put the blame on Hugh Jr., saying that she thought he kept the king away from helping her. So whether it's true or not, up to interpretation, but that's how she believed. And we know that because she wrote it in the letter. But it is worth noting, too, that Hugh Jr.'s wife was with Isabella. So I don't know. But you could be like, well, would he have put his wife in danger? But
probably.
Whatever it is.
Maybe.
Yeah. It's like, well, that'd be perfect. Then it frees. Frees up some
more
space.
time.
Things get worse from here on out. Tensions boiled over in France, and then England and France were at war again. Always. At this time, Isabella's dad has died, so it's her brother who's on the throne of France. Now that means her brother and her husband are warring in England for a long time, but it's still uncomfortable family dynamics.
For sure.
But this development would result in the biggest move against Isabella from Edward and the Despensers. Edward ends up confiscating almost all of her land, saying that it might be invaded by the French. So you're like, okay, whatever. Like, she's not plowing those lands, but those rents from the lands are what fund the queen's household. So that's her source of income.
Okay.
No land, no rents, no money. He did give her an allowance, but that's still not as much as if she had had those rents.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm thinking I know it's kind of a stretch, but it just reminds me of all those true crime stories where the husbands like financially control their spouses, like Susan Powell and Josh Powell.
I mean, it is like in that way, he can make the decision to just take her land and there's not anything she can do about it.
Exactly. And that's not even the worst of it. Years later, she was still really angry about it. And she blamed the Spencers for it in the letter, but I'm sure part of her felt anger towards her husband too. And there were reasons she wasn't blaming her husband at this time.
Sure.
So even if you can excuse these actions because they were during wartime, I think it still speaks to this growing division in the marriage. He's putting her in the same position as her brother, the King of France, which is his enemy.
Yeah.
We've come very far from the couple who were in the tent naked escaped from the fire. And Edward and the Despensers weren't done either. So Edward actually puts out an order for all French subjects to be arrested and to seize their goods conveniently. He didn't even exempt Isabella's servants and retinue. So all but one of them either got arrested or sent back to France, whittling away the people who are her closest allies, people in her household. Edward's niece, who again, Hugh Jr.'s wife, she was monitoring her correspondence at the time. Another evidence that Edward was not trusting her. In some books, they talk about Edward removing their 3 youngest children from their mother's care, but that's a myth. The kids did go out of her care, but that's just standard, normal. Yeah, we talked about it in the John of Gaunt episode where kids got their own households after even a very young age. That's a little myth busting here. Now, in March of 1325, Isabella leaves England. She's sent as like an emissary to solidify a peace between France and England, since the King of France is her brother. Edward wasn't there to say goodbye. The two of them would never see each other again.
Oh.
The Life of Edward II, which is like a chronicle for the time, said the Queen departed very joyfully. Yeah, of course she did. Your husband and his besties have made a mess of the country. I too would want a little French vacay.
How old is she at this point then?
So 1312. Don't make me do math.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to picture she's still a baby.
I think she'd been in her 20s. So she was born 1295. So 30. French vacay. Some French wine, some French teas. Nothing a little brie and wine can't solve.
Away from the kids and husband, the drama.
Plus, she's going home. It's like a true homecoming. She's got a lot of family there. She seemed to enjoy the time away from the stress, what was going on in England. And initially, everything seems very normal. She writes a letter to Edward. In the book that I read, that rebel queen noted that she called him my very sweetheart 5 times in the letter.
Oh, okay.
She got to work sealing that truce between her brother and the King of France and England. It was bad terms for England, but that wasn't her fault. It was just inevitable. Whoever would have been sent would have had bad terms. But she wasn't rushing home right after that. That's not unexpected. Royal travel takes a lot of time. And he has family, so she's hung around, dined with family members, the great and the good, and in France, doing the usual queenly stuff.
Yeah.
She wasn't in contact with any of the English rebels who had fled France to get away from Edward and the Despensers. So there had been a subset of those people who, when Edward was taking revenge against what people had done to the Despensers,
they were
had fled to France. So she wasn't in contact with them.
Okay.
So what are your general thoughts right now? I'm sure you're like, why are we talking about her? This is very medieval queen stuff.
Well, I'm guessing since your nickname is the She-Wolf, I'm guessing she's and she's never coming back to England. I'm guessing she's from France, gonna be raising hell against England, even though she's the Queen of England.
Yeah, we've hit a turning point. Normal queen stuff is going out the window. First, Isabella has Edward send their eldest son, also named Edward, over. Again, nobody has any creativity when it comes to naming their kids at this time. We're going to call him Prince Eddie.
Okay.
Because
he's the heir.
Yeah, he's a teen. I think he's like 13 at this time.
She's like basically kidnapping the heir.
Well, yeah. So technically, this is where we're going to go back to the dynamics between England and France, because technically at this time, the kings of England had to swear fealty or loyalty to the French kings because they had some, not a lot, but some lands that were still in France. a lot of that's from William the Conqueror, who was from Normandy. Then a lot of them, more of the French lands, came later when Henry II of England marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, my favorite, my baby.
Mm-hmm.
She had brought Aquitaine, this other rich French province, into the English family's royal portfolio.
Gotcha.
So they still have those lands, and they have to go over every once in a while and swear loyalty to the French kings, whether they meant it or not. But
Right.
you're supposed to go over and do it.
We're not. Like, we appreciate you letting us keep our lands.
Thank you.
Thank you. We won't go to war now.
We promise. We pinky swear. Edward's supposed to go over, but he knows that leaving the country would be leaving the dispensers in danger with those barons.
Mm-hmm.
So he waffles back and forth. Then he ends up sending his heir instead. So did Isabella convince him? We don't really know, but I'm going with the theory that she did.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people do. But for Edward, this was a very big mistake. Huge. In a life full of mistakes, this probably takes the cake.
Oh.
Late 1325, all the convention and obedience Isabella has displayed goes out the window. She refuses to return to England. We talked about Nixon in our second episode, and we talked about his, remember the Chequer speech?
Yeah.
And, how great that was. Isabella does him so much better.
She's got her own checker speech.
Oh, she plays the perfect game. So she writes this letter about not returning. And she says, okay, I feel that marriage is a joining of a man and woman holding fast to the practice of a life together. But someone has come between my husband and myself and is trying to break the bond. I declare that I will not return until this intruder is removed, but discarding my marriage garment, shall put on the robes of widowhood and mourning until I am avenged of this Pharisee. Sum it up. She pulls the Princess Diana. There was 3 people in this marriage. Can I do my best Diana?
Yes.
3 people in this marriage. It's a bit crowded.
Oh, that's nice.
The English are going to hate it.
It's okay. I mean, the whole widowhood pieces, that's ouch.
Yeah. So she's going to wear widow's clothes until the dispensers are gone. She made it clear that leaving and going back to England would be putting herself in danger. Strong words. She's not backing down, despite all the, should we say, strongly worded letters from her husband. So Edward, he's furious, but Isabella holds all the cards. Her brother, the King of France, isn't going to toss her out. When she has their oldest son and heir, Prince Eddie, her husband can complain all he wants via letter, but she was staying put. I can just see nowadays those very long text bubbles. It was just like, like ... and then it's like the massive text threads. You can already see that her political acumen is much better than her husband's. He even cuts off her money, but again, she's amongst family. They're not going to let her starve.
Right.
Edward, not willing to give an inch, he even has English bishops pen a letter to Isabella where they say that Hugh Jr. solemnly demonstrated his innocence before all. Well, if the bishops say it,
it must be true. Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not sure what he was expecting from that, but also bishops stay out of it.
Well, I'm sure they weren't super happy to get involved.
No.
Okay, great.
Like the king's telling us, so we've got to pen this letter. Widow clothes or not, Isabella was not lonely in France. Around Christmas 1325, she had met another disaffected English noble at the French court, Roger Mortimer. So he had been imprisoned by Edward, Isabella's husband, and he had escaped the Tower of London before fleeing to France. So he had actually put sedatives in the guard's wine.
Oh, and that's how he did it.
I know.
Clever.
I was like, that would work for me.
Yeah. Out of all the people to start a relationship, I'm assuming going to be starting a relationship, having somebody who your husband was trying to execute. So
it's a bold move. We'll see if it will pay off for her.
Yeah.
Isabella and Roger, they bond over their shared hatred of the dispensers, girls. It's always good to share your boyfriend's hobbies.
Yeah, there you go. Not digging ditches.
No. I mean, to be fair, both of us would be much better at judging people. Our hobbies are better at judging people per this podcast than digging ditches.
That's right.
There is some question if they were just political allies and not lovers. Most text and things that you read about them just point blank say that they were lovers. But the book that I read, again, sort of with the newest research, I was kind of taken aback knowing that the evidence is not quite there that they were truly lovers. There's as much evidence about that as there's about Edward II and his male favorites. And the relationship's really played up in books. It makes it into very romanticized versions. So I do think that's a step too far, but we don't know if they were in love or in a sexual relationship. For sure.
Some sort of partnership, though, it sounds like.
And if you side-eye Gaveston and the Dispensers for taking advantage of Edward, we should be doing the same thing with Mortimer here because he's taking advantage of the Queen.
Right.
I don't think he's doing it for the goodness of her personality. I did want to put that out there because basically everything you see says that they were lovers and they flaunted it. That's not true. Okay. At least the flaunting part. Anyways, I'm going to go with the idea that there's at least something there, like a relationship. I say let the girl have her boyfriend. Her husband does.
Yeah, seriously.
But I do want to spend a moment unpacking the Mortimer-Isabella relationship because this obviously has impacted her reputation over the many centuries. I'm going to pull out a quote from that biography, Isabella of France, the Rebel Queen, because, again, I think it's perfect when it talks about this. It says, praise is heaped on women of the past who are believed to be liberated in an approved 21st century fashion and to have broken the bonds of custom and followed their own path. Isabella of France chose her own lover if her relationship with Roger Mortimer was indeed sexual, which in the pre-modern era caused many writers to denounce her venomously as an immoral scarlet woman. And in the 21st century, has led to 1,000 books and online articles acclaiming her magnificence.
That's not surprising that she would be made the villain by taking on a lover.
But then I feel like I'm guilty of turning this into you go girl moment.
Yeah.
When I've told this story before to other people. So I will take that. Obviously, I think we should put aside that immorality piece. Who cares?
Yeah, right.
I don't think that in terms of how we're going to be judging this, if she took a lover, there's been too many affairs in history.
Right.
To have everyone who had one to call them a bad person, but
especially in royalty.
This is a time where people don't marry for love. It's not a thing. But I think there's so much more interesting and complicated things about Isabella outside of her relationship with Roger Mortimer. We talked about her marriage was at least troubled thanks to the Dispensers. But there was also that, at least some, at minimum, prior to that, some affection and love between Edward and Isabella. So it's hard. I just wanted to put that out there because, one, we don't really know what the Roger Mortimer and Isabella's relationship was. So keep that in the back of your mind.
Okay.
We'll also see that in words, in terms of that letter and what she would say at this time, is she wanted the Dispensers out so that she could get back to her marriage. She wasn't thinking I want this Roger guy and we're going to be happy and I don't want Edward back. At least what she was saying. Again, whether you believe it or not.
That's what publicly is being said.
Yeah, and we don't have diary, so that's all we have. I think we could take her word for it that she thought, you think of with the Piers situation, I was probably well, if they're gone, then things will go back to normal. I think we can take her word for it. But the pair, Isabella and Mortimer, they were doing much more than just presumably boning. They were planning, along with some other disaffected English nobles at the French court who wanted back to their homes and families. They were planning an invasion of England.
Oh.
So the Queen of England, let me repeat that, the Queen of England was planning to invade her own kingdom.
But was this given approval by the King of France?
That's a good question. We don't really know. I think, at least in the book, they were saying that the French king wouldn't at least publicly have given the seal of approval. It looks bad if you're trying to
invade.
But they do have at least one ally. So because Edward had sent their son, Prince Eddie, again, 13, to France, notably, he was unmarried, the kid. Isabella, she scored support for the invasion with Hainault. So that's like Holland, Low Countries area.
Okay.
One of those small kingdoms back then. She promised to marry her son, Eddie, to Philippa, the Count of Hainault's daughter.
Sure.
So everything was falling in place for the invasion. If you want to know more about Prince Eddie and Philippa's relationship, that's in our John of Gaunt episode.
Yeah.
We cover their relationship. This is where we have to unpack that decision. So is Isabella going to England to take care of the Despensers once and for all? Or is she going there to overthrow her husband? Why did she and Mortimer decide to sail for England?
Yeah.
I can't really know at this point, but whatever you think colors your opinion of Isabella.
Sure. So either trying to take the throne from Edward or she's dealing more with
Dispensers. Yeah. Is she trying to root out corruption, all the corruption and the chaos that the Dispensers have caused in England? Or is she trying to overthrow the anointed king, who was her husband? You can imagine how those who wrote the histories thought of it. It was the latter, that she was trying to overthrow her husband. We also have to realize that maybe Isabella and Mortimer had two different ideas.
Yeah. I mean, even what he could have been saying to her or her saying to him.
Exactly. And that's what I think is a really good point, which the biography that I read really drives home, and I don't think is talked enough in other things that I read. Most things, it's like they're lockstep, but I don't think that we have to assume that. They might have had very different ideas.
Or it might have looked on the surface like they were, but they could each have been using each other.
Yeah, I think the biography goes with the idea that Isabella might have just chosen an equally dangerous person to help with the invasion.
Kind of where I'm leaning, where it's like, okay, you're a good one to choose.
So the invasion force with Mortimer, Isabella, and Prince Eddie is going to land in England in September of 1326. And it becomes pretty clear that England was over King Edward II and the Despensers, because the invasion force gets a lot of support. It's almost like having an evil father and son helping run your government is bad. Who would have thought?
Yeah, I know.
Not me.
Yeah.
But things are about to get Games of Thrones bloody. I'm sure half the people are squirming and another half are cheering. But this is where we're going to end it for part one.
Okay.
We'll go into the invasion and the aftermath. Is that all that's going to color, again, a lot of your idea of Isabella? Things are not going to go easy. But you're going to have to wait for that one.
Okay. I know. Now I'm curious of what happened.
How are you? How are you thinking? Was this more exciting than you were expecting?
Yeah, much more drama. There's a lot of drama here. I think the hard part is, and what will be hard in the judgment is, like you said, the lack of sources. So then it's like you have to decide what you think for what she's thinking.
That's what makes it really hard, but it's kind of freed up the interpretation, and you can see why. Surprise, surprise, the people who were writing chronicles in which she lived were not quite sold on Isabella, whereas some of the actions that she does to get more support from modern people, but you're going to see that there's still some complications. A lot of people make it into a boss bitch or a boss kind of thing, and it's not that. It's not that. So we'll go into some more of her complexities.
Before we end for today, as I said in our outro, we are going to have our first listener response where they're going to give their judgment of one of the figures we've covered. It happens to be the last figure we covered, Tsarina Alexandra, and the listener happens to be Aaron's husband, Matt.
I know. I can't say anything, but he's going to put us out of a job.
I know. I was like, oh, fuck. So we just listened.
Who wants to listen to us when you could listen to him?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll stop here and we'll let Matt take it away.
Well, hello there, ambivalent offender listeners. This is Matt, and I have the honor of dropping the first of what I think Aaron and Jamie hope will become a regular segment of the podcast, some listener feedback. But just as I can't claim to be ambivalent anymore about Alexandra, it should be noted for the record. The record? Is there a record? That I do happen to be Aaron's husband. So I approach the microphone with some trepidation, fearing the consequences for our marriage if I see Alexandra differently. Can I be objective? Well, let's try. Now, as you may have heard, I am a teacher. I do teach U.S. history. So the easy way out, a trick I often deploy with my own students, is to withhold my opinions behind a kind of gauzy haze of judgment stitched together with not so clever on the other hands. But then again, but I probably shouldn't do that here. I should also probably stop stalling. Okay, let's just tear the Band-Aid off. I am more 60-40 in the Tsarina's favor, to be honest. I know there's no way around it. The luxurious lifestyle that she maintains against a backdrop of so much peasant and working class suffering, her refusal to see the wisdom of constitutional reform in a Russia that desperately needs it, and her complete inability to see the approach of revolution, that's all quite damning. But to me, those aren't so much character flaws or a failure of her intellect, so much as they are a failure of her own cultural imagination. I mean, ironically, I think that's a failure born out of what appears to have been a truly sincere, authentic effort on her part to embrace Russian society, history, language, the whole troika, as it were. I would add this too. There's a reason when you visit Western Europe that most of the people in the churches are American tourists. The Civil War inside Western Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, became so intertwined with the political intrigues and the dynastic conflicts in the 16th and 17th centuries between the Bourbons and the Tudors and the Stuarts and the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, that eventually some sort of disaffected meh came to be the ordinary European's reaction to their religious leaders, in much the same way that we deliver a kind of disaffected meh to many of our political leaders. The secular and the religious worlds just became too intertwined for the scandals of one not to pollute the other. But, it's not like that in Greece, Ukraine, Serbia, Romania, Russia. The church there still has enormous meaning in people's lives. And that's in spite of 70 plus years of communist efforts to displace it from the popular consciousness. So when Alexandra embraces the Orthodox faith and then sees it deliver for her in the form of a mystical healing that rescues her son, I think that's it. I think at that point, the curtain is closed. She's not going to be inclined to adapt or grow beyond that point. And I'm going to cut her a little slack for not being able to do that. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. I am really looking forward to the next podcast. And who knows, maybe you'll hear from me again, but it'll be neat to see who logs on next to provide some listener feedback.
Okay, now we're back. Now we both just listened to Matt's, and literally, we both just listened to it, so it's really fresh. He says it much more eloquently.
I know.
He brings in all these other references, just naming all these dynastic families. I'm like,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Gotta love him. Gotta love him. But I love him.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell if I'm surprised or not that he pretty much aligned with us, or more you. I can see why, like the reasons he gives, I think fits that.
Did you think he was gonna be more judgmental of her?
I feel like he was either going to be like this or on the other extreme. I guess with the World War, and he mentions an ability to see the coming revolution. I guess I think he would be maybe a little more judgmental of her.
Yeah.
How about you? Did that fit pretty much what you thought?
I think so. I think as a history teacher, you're pretty good at filtering through all that crap and finding the real important pieces. So I'm not super surprised. Obviously, cases have been made for thinking of her in much worse light. Right. As you said, most of the information for the last decades have been really negative on her. But I do think based on what we shared and more what's come out and what we expect from somebody in her position, I think some of that's softened.
Yeah. I even saw when I was scrolling through Facebook, there was like a post about the Romanovs. Again, pretty much all the comments were about Nicholas and not Alexandra. There was definitely, though, a softening attitude of like people saying they had a soft spot for him or things like that.
Yeah, I think as we've gotten further away between books that you talked about and things, people are approaching her in a different way than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union, I think plays a big part. Awesome. Well, it was great to have our first listener feedback comments.
Reminder that you can send us one about any of the people that we've covered.
Yep. Doesn't have to be the last one. So it could be anyone. If you want to tackle Nixon, go ahead.
Oh, I'm gonna send one in. I love him. He's the best. I think you were way too rude about him. We need some of that Nixon Foundation money.
Yeah, maybe they'll send one in. But yes, feel free to send one in. Again, Matt's was about 4 minutes, so it could be up to like 4 or 5 minutes. As I said, to ambivalent.offenders.podcast@gmail.com. Besides that, if you can follow or rate or download our podcast, we always appreciate that. And even obviously streaming anywhere that you get your podcast, we certainly appreciate the listeners. And of course, if you can tell any friends who might enjoy the podcast as well, we always like having new listeners as we continue to grow. And Erin, for part 2, I know you were saying what to expect in the episode, but when can we expect part 2 to drop?
Probably by Wednesday, I would think.
Yeah. So keep checking. Instagram is our number one place to look for. We always give the heads up when episodes are about to drop, especially the part 2s. And our regular schedule is weekly on Sundays, either Sunday night or Monday morning. Although, as I told Erin, I'm like, we've done so many part 2s, parts 3s. It would feel weird just to do one a week. So maybe we'll fit in a mini or something in between.
And be sure to check out Instagram. I have a reel out there as a preview for this episode with Piers and Edward and Isabella, and then I will be posting another funny Piers one.
Yeah, now I'm going to rewatch it, and it's going to be even more hilarious. So I'm very excited to do that. So again, thank you. As we said, follow us on all those social media and also get our Patreon. We appreciate any support for the show.
Yeah.
So we're signing off here, and we will continue Isabella's story here soon.
Yeah. Bye, guys.